Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar, The Art of Connecting, Overcome Boredom and Engage Any Audience, featuring our host, David P. Odie. In case you are less familiar with us, the work we do at the Alda Center is about empowering scientists, medical professionals, and researchers to communicate their work clearly and vividly to all audiences. Thanks for being here with us today, David. We are really looking forward to your talk.
Well, thank you, Jamie. I appreciate that introduction. Let's jump right into it. How many times have you had this happen? You prepare a presentation on the topic of your work, you pour your heart and soul into it, you just know your audience is going to find it every bit as fascinating as you do. You get up to present, they listen politely, if perhaps passively. You take a question or two, you thank them for coming, they file out, and you're left wondering, did that make any difference to those people? Now, you may be a scientist, in which case you're used to measuring things, going where the data take you. How do you measure your impact on that audience? How do you overcome that nagging feeling that you just didn't quite grab them the way you wanted to? Or worse, the feeling that you left them either bored or confused. I think everyone I know who gives presentations has experienced what I just described. I know I have, but before I tell you about one such experience, I just want to say thank you to the Alda Center for Communicating Science, and of course the Kavli Foundation and the American Chemical Society for making this possible. I will never forget the day I learned just how boring a technical presentation can be. Unfortunately, I was the one giving it. The first time that I went to a engineering conference to deliver a technical paper, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have a clue. Well, okay, I had one clue, and that was that I knew enough not to simply read the paper to somebody. But beyond that, I didn't really know how to measure my success. I didn't know how to, I didn't have a rubric. I didn't have a paradigm. I was lost. And without that, I didn't have any way of measuring my success. Now, since then, things have changed. Since then, I am happy to say things have changed for the better. I've spoken to standing room only crowds at scientific conferences. I've watched as they hurried over to the book signing table when I was done. So I didn't stay where I was in Houston all those years ago at my first conference. I've been on a journey of discovery, a journey to learn what it means to communicate effectively, especially about technical topics. Topics like the topics I often had to deal with as chief engineer of a TV station, or a topic of a new digital technology that was being rolled out in the broadcasting industry starting around 2006. I found myself, in fact, leading the industry-wide training effort on that technology. And that training effort would ultimately reach over 10,000 engineers and technicians in broadcast facilities across the country. We succeeded in that effort. But before we could succeed, we had to fail. And we failed because we weren't meeting the needs of our audience. That brings me to the central problem at the core of what we're doing here today. Now, I assume that if you're attending this webinar or if you are watching its replay, you want to get better at giving information-rich presentations. Okay, but here's the thing. Your information goes nowhere if you don't meet the needs of your audience. Let me put that up on the screen and share it with you. Your information goes nowhere if you do not meet the needs of your audience. I think there's some powerful implications of that claim for people who are information driven, knowledge driven, data driven, like many of us here today. But this is the basic problem that we are faced with when it comes to giving technical presentations. Now, my premise today is that you don't have to stay there. My premise is that every engineer, scientist, IT professional, project manager, anyone who has to give technical presentations can learn to give presentations that people remember and that prompt listeners to take action if they don't make 3 common mistakes. That's the key. If they don't make 3 common mistakes. Now, in a moment, you're going to discover what those mistakes are, the effect they have, and how to avoid them. But first, let's do what scientists do, right? Let's get some baseline data. I'm going to put a question up here. And what I'm going to do in just a moment is switch to a live web page where you can respond to 3 statements regarding how you feel about your presentation skills. Let me change that share real quick. I'm just going to do this and go here. That should be it. Oh, no, that's the wrong thing. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Isn't that what we say? Wrong screen. There we go. All right. So the question is how you feel about your presentation skills. You have a chance here to respond to this Likert scale on a 1 to 5 basis, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I feel confident and in control when I give a presentation. I know how to keep my audience engaged. I am confident my listeners will take appropriate action after hearing me speak. These are 3 dimensions on which we might assess our confidence in our presentation skills. And you can watch with me here as the data come in. We're just going to collect some data for a few minutes. Well, a few moments, let's say. I don't want to be specific about that. And as the data come in, we're going to save those, and we'll see. I'm actually going to be very bold here. Toward the end of this presentation, we'll see if I've managed to change any of your answers. So we've got an N of about 71, 72. Responses are still coming in. So I'm going to leave this up so that you can respond to it for a bit longer. I notice, though, looking at the tendency here, that people have the least confidence, apparently, in the fact that your audience is going to do something specific when you're done. And that's really at the heart of what we're here to talk about today. I feel confident that by the end of this presentation, you'll have some new tools that will help you with that very thing, okay? So let's look at the first mistake. I said there are 3 mistakes you want to avoid. The first mistake is the one that I made in a big way when I led the team that created that training project back in 2006. We were a group of engineers tasked with creating a training curriculum. And what could go wrong? We put together a beautiful curriculum full of the best available information about how those TV stations were going to benefit from coded orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. Are you excited yet? Well, our trainees weren't. In our initial tests, the training was not well received. So I went back to the drawing board. I did something radical. I spent time with the people in the industry who were actually going to be using this new technology in their news vans and helicopters. And of course, they didn't want to know how the new radio technology was going to work any more than your average 16-year-old wants to know how fuel injection works before they get their driver's license. How did they feel about this new technology? Well, one of them told me point blank, I'm afraid I'm going to get yelled at when my live shot goes down in the middle of the 10 o'clock news. Okay, 11 o'clock news if you're not on Central or Mountain Time. The problem our training needed to solve was not lack of information, it was fear. And once we learned that, we had to take a completely different approach, one that was ultimately successful because, in effect, we showed them how little they had to fear. The new technology was going to make their job easier, not harder. The mistake we had made is the same one I see made over and over by engineers, scientists, essentially any quantitative thinker giving information-rich presentations. They think they are there to serve the information. They forget, or perhaps they never knew, that they are there to serve the needs of their audience. So mistake number one is being information-centric instead of being audience-centric. Mistake number one is being information-centric instead of being audience-centric. Now let's explore what that means for just a moment. When I say being information-centric, you may be thinking, well, but I deliver information. That's what I do. But what happens when presenters don't think about their audience's needs or how they're there to serve them? Well, what you get as a result is an audience that is disconnected, bored, or possibly confused. In any case, they are not receptive to the presenter's information, and therefore they are not likely to take the desired effect after, or excuse me, take the desired action after hearing it. If you've ever reached the end of a presentation and felt unsure of the effect you just had on your audience, then you know what that kind of disconnect feels like. Here's what I've learned in order to avoid that outcome. It's a two-step process. First step, you've got to know who your audience is. What do they need from you? What are they interested in hearing from you? Why did they bother to come and hear you speak? What problem has driven them to you for a solution? What keeps them awake at night? If you don't know the answers to these questions, see if you can ask them. When I have a speaking engagement, I'll often ask the meeting planner to put me in touch with some of the prospective attendees just so I can ask them questions like those. If that's not possible, you need to at least get up out of your information long enough to make an educated, well-informed guess as to why your audience is likely to show up in that particular audience to hear you. That's step one. The second step is to get clear on what you are there to do for that audience. That is, what difference do you want to make for them? The way to do that is to use a tool called the specific purpose. The specific purpose is the first of several tools you're going to pick up in this webinar. And it's the answer to this question: what do I want my listeners to think, do, or feel differently when I am done? Let me put that on the screen for you. Now, this is not your general purpose. Your general purpose, I'm sure you're already aware of. Your general purpose can usually be described in 2 or 3 words, like I'm there to inform, I'm there to explain, I'm there to educate. Maybe you're there to persuade. But if your purpose can be described in 2 or 3 words, it's not yet specific enough to keep you focused on how you are serving your audience. So your specific purpose is the answer to this question: what do I want my listeners to think, do, or feel differently when I'm done? In other words, what difference do you want to make? How are you going to change the condition of your listeners? If you're not there to make a difference, you really ought not be giving a presentation. You should just hand people printed information. But you are giving a presentation because instinctively you know that people engage with a speaker in a different way than they engage with the printed word, even a virtual speaker, as we have in this particular situation. What do you want your listeners to think, do, or feel differently when you're done? It may be a combination of 2 or even all 3 of these things. For example, you might want your fellow scientists to both to think differently about the question at the heart of your research and also to take action like collaborating with you. Or you may want someone to decide to fund the next stage of your research. And don't forget don't underestimate the importance of that third verb, feel. You may be thinking, what place does feeling have in a technical presentation? Well, if you're talking to people who are responsible for your funding, you want them to feel confident that it's money well spent. Not just to hear the statistics and the data. You want them to feel that they made the right choice. What do you want them to think, do, or feel differently? Once you know the answer to that question, that becomes the filter through which every piece of content, every sentence, every paragraph, every image on the screen must pass before it is allowed into your presentation. If it does not support your specific purpose, it does not go in. And since this forces you to think about how you plan to change your audience's condition, it moves you in the direction of being more audience-centric, thereby avoiding mistake number one, which is being information-centric instead of being audience-centric. Now I'd like you to try it. All right? We're going to workshop this a little bit. I want you to think about an upcoming presentation you may be working on. If you don't have one on the horizon right now, think of the last one you gave and imagine that you're planning to give it again, only better this time. Okay? What is your specific purpose? I want you to be able to come up with a statement that says what you want your audience members to think, do, and or feel differently when you're done. Now, we're going to do something that I think may be a little bold for the number of people we have on this webinar, but I'm going to let you give an open-ended response on the, just a moment, on the Menti page. I have to stop. I'm going to do a new share here, and I'm going to go back to this and then change the slide. All right. You have a chance now to type in an open-ended response, and we're going to watch as they come scrolling into the screen. Now, obviously, I'm not going to have a chance to read everyone's responses, but I want you to engage with me in this way. You want your audience to write, okay? You want your audience to be inspired. Let's see some more answers. You want your audience to be educated, okay? Pass qualifying examination. You know what I like about that one is that it's so specific. You want to convince your thesis committee that your research is well thought out and achievable. You want someone to collaborate with you. Try to be as specific as you possibly can. You want them to question long-held assumptions. Act. When you say you want them to act, you want them to act in what way? What is the particular thing you want them to do to feel motivated and confident enough to do when you are done? To think what I do is relevant to them. Do you agree with my proposal? These are great responses. The shorter your response is, the more likely it is that if I were coaching you, I would say go deeper. Try to find something even more specific. To think differently about everyday materials. Appreciate the role of fungi in health and disease. These are great topics. I'd love to hear some of your presentations. You want them to make them aware of the importance of basic science and its application to many human diseases. This is great. You're beginning to be more focused on your audience's needs already. You can keep those answers coming in, and what I'm going to do now is we'll come back and check on this if we have some time later on. Let me go back to something here very quickly. So, you know what? I'm just going to leave these answers scrolling here. Just going to leave the answers scrolling. So, if I were to tell you, let's say, my specific purpose for this webinar today, it is, I had some practice at this. It's really threefold. You see, I'm going to use all three of those verbs. I want you to think differently about your role in giving a presentation. I want you to use some of the tools you're picking up here today to prepare your next presentation, and I want you to feel confident that using those tools can make a difference. See, you can go for all three of those, and feeling, I believe, is very much a part of it. So those are your two steps to becoming more audience-centric. Know who your audience is and what they need from you, and then ask specifically how you're going to change their condition by using the specific purpose tool. Now that brings us to the second mistake that you want to avoid. I'm just going to lay it out for you. It is a lack of clarity on your core message. I'm going to have to take the Menti screen away for right now because I want to share this with you instead. Lack of crystal clarity about your core message is the second mistake that people often make. And I encountered an interesting tool that we're going to pick up here in just a minute. But before we do that, let me share with you what I mean about your core message. You have perhaps heard someone say, if you can't write your idea on the back of a business card, you don't have an idea. The actual source of that quote is much debated, so I can't really try to attribute it for you. But I can attribute another quote to someone I know. One of my speaking mentors, a gentleman by the name of Craig Valentine, he says, a clear mind says go, a confused mind says no. Okay? So what happens when you're unclear on your core message is that whatever you want your audience to think, do, or feel after they hear you speak is not likely to happen because they lack that clarity. So it's another way in which we fail to serve our audience. Remember, the core problem that we're getting at here is that your information goes nowhere if you don't meet the needs of your audience. And what the audience needs from you is clarity. I recently ran across a fascinating tool for gaining clarity. Now, this comes from a book that I recommend to you. It's called Houston, We Have a Narrative, and the author's name is Randy Olson. Now, Randy Olson, it's interesting. He was trained as a marine biologist. He left a tenured position as an academic scientist and moved to Hollywood to learn how to make movies. And his journey has led him to some startling insights into how science is communicated. And in this book, he offers up several great tools. I'm going to share one of them with you today, and I want you to know where I got it. This tool is called the Dobzhansky template. Now, I could be mispronouncing that name. I'm sorry, I'm not trained in Russian, and it's a Russian name. Theodosius Dobzhansky was a prominent Russian-American geneticist, don't leave out a syllable, David, and evolutionary biologist who famously said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. It's a remarkably clear statement about the explanatory power of evolution in only 11 words. Now, our topic here today is not necessarily biology or evolution, but here's the thing. Randy Olson says you can take that sentence and use it as a template for making an equally clear statement about your topic. Just replace the word biology with your topic and then see what word or short phrase can complete that sentence. For example, my topic is scientific presentations. I might say, nothing in scientific presentations or nothing in communicating science, let's put it that way, makes sense except in the light of narrative structure. I believe nothing in communicating science makes sense except in the light of narrative structure. Now, that's a statement about the power of narrative, and its power comes from its compactness. Let's take another example. Let's say that your topic is the connection between sea level rise and human activity resulting in climate change. You might say, nothing in sea level rise makes sense except in the light of human activity. A very straightforward statement. Now, interestingly enough, I was sharing this with someone the other day, and it was one of my coaching clients, and I have been coaching this person to avoid using absolutes in her speech, in her speaking, words like always and never. And she said, well, this sentence starts with an absolute. It's the word nothing. I said, that's a legitimate point. So I had to think about that for a minute. The sentence, if you want to look at it in that light, perhaps engages in a bit of hyperbole, let's say. As scientists, we often stay away from absolutes like nothing and always. When you sea level rise makes sense except in the light of human activity, that's a bold statement. Now, let me be clear on something. This sentence may never appear in your actual presentation. It's a tool for clarifying your own thinking on the topic. It helps you boil down your topic to the most essential word or short phrase. I have to confess to you at a personal level, my favorite scientist is my sister. I have a sister who is a cell biologist. She has worked in a physiology department, so she's actually a cell physiologist. She studies cytoskeletal structures. And I asked her about this just the other day. I said, how would you explain your work using this template? And she said, nothing in human physiology makes sense except in the light of human anatomy. In other words, if you want to understand the function of something, you have to start by understanding its form. It's structure. Now I want you to try it, okay? We're going to try this again. We're going to see how many responses we have coming in. I apologize, I did not make it clear to someone earlier about the code that you have to enter when you go to the Menti page. It is on the screen. And so I'm going to go back to that now in just a moment here. Bear with me a moment, please. Let's go back to this. Okay, let's see. These are the answers that came in to the previous short answer question about think, do, or feel differently when you're done. Good job engaging with me on your specific purpose. Now I want you to engage with me using the Dobzhansky template, and I want you to write a sentence. Don't just give me words because I may miss the relationship between them. Write a sentence. Nothing in blank makes sense except in the light of blank. Now, I'm not going to understand all of your topics here because my background is in the physical sciences, not the life sciences. That's why I love having conversations with my sister because she's a biologist. Nothing in research data makes sense except in the light of metadata or metadata. You'll have to tell me which is your preferred pronunciation. Nothing in astronomy makes sense except in the light of the Big Bang Theory. Nothing in development makes sense except in the light of gene expression. So as you're writing these, I want you to be thinking about how you're going to use this tool the next time you are preparing a presentation. What this allows you to do, excuse me just a moment here. There we go. What this allows you to do is to boil down the essence of your topic into a word or short phrase. So if you're talking about public health, and you're going off on a tangent and not talking about the environment, that's your check to say, wait, let's go back to environment because nothing in public health makes sense except in the light of the environment, as a statement that's been shared with me here. So as you work through this, it's a tool to help you focus so you can gain crystal clarity with your audience. Let's leave those up for just a moment. Go back to this. Thank you for staying with me. Let's look at some of these others. Now, I wonder if someone's being tongue-in-cheek on this one. Nothing in higher education communications makes sense except in the light of U.S. News and World Report rankings. I won't challenge that. Nothing in leadership makes sense except in the light of context. Nothing in the brain makes sense except in the light of context and behavior. And nothing in learning makes sense except in the light of the brain. Thank you for sharing those responses with me. I hope you're going to find that tool to be helpful to you. Now, I'm going to go to a new share here. But before I do that, I'm actually going to stop the sharing and just talk to you directly because I like doing this. I know I can't see you, but now you can see me. The third mistake, we've had two so far. The first mistake is being information-centric instead of being audience-centric. The second mistake is lacking clarity, which results in your audience being unclear on what you expect them to comprehend, process, and do afterwards. And the third mistake is probably the biggest one of all right? It's the one mistake that virtually every technical presenter makes, and they make it because they probably don't believe me when I say it's a mistake. For you to understand the significance of this mistake, we simply have to do a little math. Now, this is where I'm going to share a slide with you again. We simply have to do a little math. On the left of your screen, you see a speaker at a lectern. And on the right, you see someone reading. Now, here's where the math comes in. The person on the left is probably, if we're talking a native speaker of North American English, let me at least throw in that caveat, probably speaking at a rate of 125 to 150 words per minute. From the sources I've read, that's the typical range. Men tend to run toward the low end of that range. Women tend to run toward the high end of that range. I don't know why. I know that I tend to speak right in the middle, 135 to 140 words per minute. I know this because I've given enough timed presentations. By the way, that's an excellent tool to keep in mind the next time you have to fit your presentation into an amount of time. Write out what you're going to say. I know that's a challenge. It's an effective tool, though. Write out what you're going to say and look at your word count and just divide it by your speaking rate, which probably falls into that range. That way you know the number of minutes it'll take you. So I fall into the middle of that range, which may be a little on the high side for men. Okay, I grew up with sisters. I raised daughters. I've lived my life surrounded by women. Draw your own conclusions. But the reader, what about that reader? That reader is likely reading at a rate of 250 to perhaps as many as 300 words per minute, about twice as fast as the speaker can speak. So let's look at the implications of that. Let's say you're giving an hour presentation. And let's say that as an alternative to me listening to your presentation, you could simply write down what you're going to say and hand it to me in written form. I could probably read that hour-long presentation in half an hour. Okay, but you're not giving it to me to read. You're presenting it live, and I'm in your audience. You're expecting me to give you an hour of my attention in return for what amounts to half an hour's worth of information. That sounds like a pretty raw deal to me. But that is the deal that every speaker makes with every audience, and it's what I call the grand bargain. Speakers have to bargain with their audience for their attention. Your audience does not owe you their attention. You don't owe me your attention. I'm aware every minute of this presentation that I have to continue earning it and deserving it. And I'm also aware that in this virtual environment, there are so many distractions available to you. You don't even have the social pressure of having to stay in your seat with your eyes forward. You could be doing any number of different things. The audience does not owe you their attention. You as the speaker owe it to them to live up to your side of the grand bargain, which means you have to offer something besides just information. So mistake number 3 is failing to recognize that in your part of the grand bargain, you've got to engage with your audience at an emotional level. Your information is not enough. Mistake number 3 is failure to engage the audience at an emotional level. Now, that's a little bit redundant because if you look up the word engage or engagement, what you'll find is that the relevant definition of it to us is an emotional involvement or connection. So yes, I'm repeating the word emotional here in the interest of underscoring the importance of it. Mistake number 3 that contributes to our problem, and remember that the problem statement is your information goes nowhere if you don't meet the needs of your audience. Your audience needs a connection with you to feel like it's worth giving you their attention, okay? Now, I sometimes, when I coach speakers who are giving technical talks, I sometimes get pushback on engaging emotionally. And that's somewhat predictable, right? In fact, I've had people tell me, well, David, I'm there to deliver information, not to entertain. That's fine. That is perfectly fine because the opposite of boredom is not entertainment, it is engagement. The opposite of boredom is not entertainment, but engagement. Your job is not to bore your audience. Neither is it to entertain your audience. It is to engage your audience. Why do you need a level of emotional engagement? Well, modern neuroscience has shown us that the decision-making center in the brain is located in the emotional part of the brain. And you see, for you to make a connection with your audience, for you to satisfy their need for that grand bargain, your audience has to make several decisions. They have to decide, first of all, to accept your information. Second, to remember your information. And third, to take action. Every one of those is a discrete decision. Your listeners must make the decision to accept your information, to remember your information, to take action. Notice the underlined letters, A.R.T, hence the art of connection, hence our title. You may have stayed with me just long enough to find out why the why that acronym was in the title. I call this the art of connection, because when you connect with people, they will accept your information, remember your information, and take action. That's why my tools are all about helping you make a connection with your audience that will ensure a greater likelihood that they'll take the action you want them to take. Connection is an interesting thing. Connection is clearly happening at an emotional level. Now, one reason this is important is because of some research into how people form first impressions. You may be aware that people form first impressions very quickly. And when you get up on the stage to give a talk, people are forming a first impression of you very, very quickly and deciding within seconds if they want to give you their attention. Harvard researcher Amy Cuddy, C-U-D-D-Y, published an interesting book a few years ago called Presence. Excuse me. Just needed a sip of water. A book called Presence. And in that book, she looks at some research that's been done into this whole question of how people make those first impressions. And it turns out that what people are typically doing is they're deciding on very quickly on the answer to two questions. And those two questions are, can I trust this person? And we'll symbolize that with the heart on the left. And is this person someone who is competent to do something useful for me, as indicated by the medal and ribbons on the right? Warmth and competence are the terms that psychologists use to describe those two dimensions, warmth and competence. People are assessing you as a speaker very quickly before they ever hear your evidence. They're assessing you based on warmth and competence. And here's the thing. They're doing that in a specific order. And I wonder if you can guess which one comes first. Hint, it's not the one that we scientists, engineers, technical presenters usually want to present first. Because what do we usually want to present first? Our credentials, our academic degrees, our work history. It's all about competence, right? No, according to the research, it turns out that people assess warmth before competence, which from an evolutionary standpoint makes perfect sense. If you're, let's say you're a primitive human in a primitive society in a very dangerous environment, and you come across a stranger, the first thing you need to know is this person going to kill or rob me, before you concern yourself with this person's skill at building a fire or helping you hunt down dinner? But it goes against what we, who are information-rich, knowledge-driven people, are typically trying to do. But the research shows you've got to establish trust first, or as I like to put it, connection before content. You've got to put connection before content. You've got to make a connection with your audience. Why? Because your information goes nowhere if you don't meet the needs of your audience. Now, it's one thing to say, well, we need to connect with people. It's another thing to say, okay, great, David, give me the tools. Give me a tool for doing that. I'm going to give you one such tool in just a minute. And before I give you that tool, you need to understand that there's some biochemistry behind it, okay? The biochemistry is all about oxytocin. Some of you may be familiar with oxytocin. This is a neurotransmitter which, when it is expressed in the brain, leads to feelings of warmth or empathy toward another person. It is sometimes called by laymen the bonding hormone, although I suppose that the biochemists on the call may question the use of the word hormone. I don't claim to be a biologist or a chemist, so I will use the word neurotransmitter. Now, the interesting thing about a surge of oxytocin in the brain is that it will make you feel empathy towards someone. Why is that of interest to you as a speaker? Because you want your audience to feel empathy toward you. Then they'll want your solution to their problem. They'll trust that you are providing a good solution to their problem. And here's the interesting thing about getting a surge of oxytocin in order to create empathy. It goes back to another Harvard researcher. This is a fellow by the name of Paul Zak. Paul Zak has done a lot of research into how, under what conditions, the brain expresses oxytocin. And it's interesting because you may be familiar with the fact that you get a surge of oxytocin in the brain when you, for example, are caressed by a lover, okay? Or even when you hug someone, or even when you pet your dog, you get a rush of oxytocin. But here's what Paul Zak found. He found that you also get a surge of oxytocin when you hear a well-told story. So fear not, I'm not going to instruct you to go wandering through the crowd, giving people hugs before your talk, or taking your dog through for people to pet. Instead, what I advocate is the use of story as a tool for communicating science. But it has to be a story that meets particular requirements. Paul Zak said in the Harvard Business Review, we discovered in our research that a story must first sustain attention, a scarce resource in the brain. Because think how many stimuli are competing for your attention right now. By developing tension during the narrative. Tension sustains attention. He went on to say, my experiments show that character-driven stories with emotional content result in a better understanding of the key points a speaker wishes to make and enable better recall of these points weeks later. Weeks later. Make a connection with your audience and they will remember what you had to say. They may not remember your exact words, but they will remember the feeling they took from hearing you say those words, and that will connect them with the outcomes you're looking for. Now, how do you do this? Well, I'm going to give you a very simple model here. I do storytelling workshops that go on anywhere from half a day to 2 days. We don't have time for that today, but what I am going to give you, what you're going to pick up right now, is the most basic storytelling model I know. Yes, it's a simple formula. A wants B despite C. Let me explain. A is the protagonist of the story. If you're telling a personal story about your research, chances are you are A. And you want something. You want to show something. You want people to understand the relationship between the things we were looking at on the previous screen, between public health and the environment. You want people desperately to understand this, or you want to understand how you can influence public health through influencing the environment. You want something. Something is driving you to do the research that you're doing. I mean, otherwise, wouldn't you have picked an easier job than being a scientist? So you want something. That's B, the thing you want. Despite C, an obstacle. You want something despite an obstacle. You can apply this model to any story you know. Cinderella wants to go to the ball and meet the prince despite not having appropriate attire or transportation. Dorothy wants to go home from Oz despite a host of misadventures, including a wicked witch who wants her shoes. The three little pigs want a safe place to live despite the big bad wolf and arguably lax building codes. So a desire sets a story in motion, but the story is very short and uninteresting unless that desire is initially thwarted by some obstacle. Now, here's the thing about scientific presentations. When you get up to give a presentation based on a paper, do you tell people the obstacles you had to overcome? Do you tell people about the strong desire that propelled you into doing the research you're doing? I dare say in a paper you probably don't. But here's the difference between a paper and a presentation. People connect with the spoken word in a different way than they expect to connect with the written word. Remember that grand bargain. You've got to bring something else to the table. And if you bring to the table your willingness to share with people, this is something that was really hard for us to figure out initially until we got this great insight that helped us overcome this obstacle. Wow, people are going to be on the edge of their seats wanting to know your solution before you even tell them what it is. Now, I have people tell me all the time, well, David, I don't need to tell a story. I've got compelling information, and besides, I don't have a story. I've just got information that I know people will find compelling. Why do I need to tell people a story? And my response to that, besides telling them what you've already heard, that you got to live up to your side of the grand bargain and bring something else to the table, the other thing I tell them is you do have a story. And that story is the story of how the information you got was the obstacle, was rather the object of your desire. For example, you might ask questions like, or I might ask them questions like, what need drove you to discover this information? Or what did this information mean to you when you first learned it? or what makes it so compelling that it must be shared? I've actually come up with a list of about 8 questions like this that can help you understand, or excuse me, help you uncover the story behind your information. If you'd like to, you can look those up in the first of my books. It's one called The Speaker's Quick Guide to Telling Better Stories. Not trying to sell it here. I'm just telling you it is available. You can find it in paperback and Kindle formats on Amazon, and paperback and Nook formats on barnesandnoble.com. Now, where have we come? Where have we been so far? We've had a problem statement. Your information goes nowhere if you don't meet the needs of your audience. We have some solutions that center on avoiding 3 mistakes. The mistake of being information-centric, the mistake of not being clear on your core concept, and the mistake of failing to engage your audience at an emotional level. So let me just put this slide back up. Back up a moment. So the solution, of course, to those 3 mistakes is don't make them. Be audience-centric, not information-centric. How can you be audience-centric? Start with an understanding of who your audience is and what they need from you, and then address the specific purpose question using that tool. What do you want your listeners to think, do, or feel differently when you're done? The second tool you picked up, the Dobzhansky template from Randy Olson, is a way of making sure that you are being very clear on the word or key phrase at the heart of the concept that you're there to talk about. And then a way, not the only way, to engage your audience at an emotional level is by telling the story of your work, putting it in narrative form, using the model A wants B despite C. Now, I'm not going to ask you to share stories with me right now because that would be a little bit impractical. I'll give you my email address later, and if you'd like to engage with me some more on the subject of story and tell me a story that you might be working on, I'll be happy to help you shape it. Before we take some questions, I have a question for you, and for this, I'm going to go back to the website again. However, in this case, you're going to have a new code to enter. You're going to go to menti.com and enter a new code. And again, and you'll have to give me just a moment to switch this around because I needed to make sure I kept the data from the first time we did this. So I have to change something here. Bear with me just a moment. I'd love to make this more seamless. It's not perfectly seamless yet. Bear with me. All right. So how do you feel about your presentation skills now? Let me change my sharing so that I'm sharing this screen with you. And we're going to see how much we might have moved the scale. All right. I'm noticing a higher degree of confidence. I'm noticing especially a higher degree of confidence in keeping your audience engaged and knowing that or sensing that your listeners will take appropriate action after hearing you speak. So thank you. That's a relief. If those numbers had gone down, I'd be rather worried right now. Let's see, we have an N of 77 at the moment. We'll see how many of those keep coming in. I'm reasonably sure, and if there's any statisticians in the audience, you can certainly check me on this. I'm reasonably sure that with that number of responses, we are seeing statistically significant differences between the before and the after, and that warms my heart. That is certainly helpful to know when it comes to answering the question, what kind of job am I doing for you here? I have a question that's coming in right now, and what I'm going to do is I will introduce a Q&A session that we're going to take because we have some time for it. There's not any problem with that at all, and I love engaging people directly on Q&A. But before I do that, I want to share something with you that I'm going to model for you, that is also a practice that I advocate for. And this is going to blow your minds because this is completely different from what you see done virtually all the time. And it is quite simply this: never end your presentation with Q&A. Whoa, that's the sound of heads exploding, I'm sure. What do I mean by that? Always have some sort of concluding remark. Notice I was careful not to say conclusion, because in a scientific presentation that has a specific meaning, but rather a concluding remark of no more than a minute or two. And you cue your audience in thusly. You say, I have time now, I have at least a good 10 minutes or more for questions. And after your questions, I will share some concluding remarks with you, so don't go away. Now, why do I do this? Well, one of my favorite mentors in the speaking world is a woman by the name of Patricia Fripp. And Patricia Fripp has a favorite saying. She says, last words linger. If the last words people hear you say, if the last words you heard me say today were, well, I guess there's no more questions, how memorable would that be? You see, you have an obligation to bring something to the table all the way to the end, all the way to the end, and to retain engagement, to maintain engagement with your audience. That means you need to be able to engage them clear through the Q&A section. So always time it in such a way that you have time for questions before your concluding remarks. The other thing I will tell you is that in addition to my concluding remarks that I'll take after this question and answer session, I'm also going to share with you a very important resource. I see some questions coming in about story. Let me tell you this. The ABC model is a very simple, quick to learn story model. There are many others, and there are some other tools that I can leave you with that work better in a workshop setting than in this setting. So what I've done is I've taken a couple of those tools and put them together in a template that you can use that I call the 5-minute first draft. How would you like to spend 5 minutes creating the first draft of your next talk and do it in a way that is conversational and will engage your audience? Well, stay with me, because you're going to pick up a website, a URL that will take you to such a tool in a few minutes. So while I'm taking questions, first of all, let me thank you for the 109 people who responded here, showing me that you feel more confident in your ability to keep your audience engaged and get them to take action. So thank you so much for that. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change back to this slide and put my contact information up on the screen, so that if by any chance I don't get your question answered, you can feel free to contact me with questions using my email address. So let me take a look at some of the questions that have come in here. I had a question: can you tell your audience your specific purpose up front? Now, when I saw that question come in, I shared my specific purpose with you. Did you notice that? But you don't have to tell people that explicitly. You don't have to say, here's my specific purpose. It depends on the situation. I can't give you a better answer than that. But let me give you an example. Think back to the training project I led from 2006 to 2009. Yes, it took us 3 years almost, but we trained over 10,000 people in that time. We never went into them and said, hey, we're here to take away your fear. Because how do you think they would have responded to that? A bunch of engineers and news van and helicopter technicians. One of them admitted to me in a one-on-one situation that he was fearful of getting yelled at or losing his job. But I think if we had gone in and said, I'm here to take away your fear, we might have gotten a little bit of pushback. So your specific purpose in your mind, whether you choose to share that with your audience or not, I'm going to have to leave up to you. Are there other story types you might share is another question that came in. There is a delightful model that I've encountered recently enough that I've not yet worked it into this presentation, but you'll see it worked into the 5-minute first draft exercise that I'm going to direct you toward in a few minutes. And this is also from Randy Olson's book, Houston, We Have a Narrative. It's a story model based on 3 words, and it sounds a little bit like the ABC model, but it's the ABT model, okay? That stands for 3 words: and, but, and therefore. You're welcome to write those down. And, but, and therefore. Let me give you some examples of how that works. Think back to my opening story of going from Austin, where I was working, to Houston, where that conference was, to deliver a paper. I could summarize that story this way. I remember the first time I went to a technical conference to deliver a paper, and I wanted to do so well and impress my peers, but at the end of it, I could see they were bored. Therefore, I knew I had a lot to learn about presentation skills. You see, in essentially one sentence there, I've set up that story using and, but, therefore. If someone else would like to chime in to the chat box, which is what I have open over here on one side now, with a way that you could use and, but, therefore to tell the story you were thinking of earlier when I asked you about your specific purpose, I'd be willing to share that. Let me go on through, are there other story types you might share? There are a number of different models that I use in my longer workshops on storytelling. I owe credit for a couple of those to someone I mentioned before, Craig Ballantyne. He has something called the 5-part skeletal framework for a story. That is, if you can't tell a story in 5 sentences describing the character, the conflict, the cure, change, and the carry-out message, then until you can do that, you don't have a story. You just have a perhaps amusing anecdote. Should your story weave through your entire presentation, or does it serve as an initial setup? Think about how I've used a couple of the stories that I incorporated into this presentation. You heard me say earlier on about going to Houston and delivering a paper at a conference and feeling I had not done a good job. And I was able to come back to that and then even draw a contrast with it to explain some of the things that I've learned. I've also mentioned to you the story of the training project that I led from 2006 to 2009 that reached over 10,000 people, and how I had to learn to meet the needs of those audience members before our information would take root and do anybody any good. So I think that a story, when used effectively, can be woven through the entire presentation. And in particular, it can give you a very good tool for closing your presentation in a memorable way, because you can go back to that story at the end. Let me give you, because we have the time, it looks like, let me give you one more little tip about making a story memorable. Going off script here, calling an audible. There are a number of different ways to make a story memorable. One is to make sure you're using very specific words, that you're speaking about particular moments, not things that happen on an ongoing basis. So that's why I talked about the moment that I was in Houston. But this is something I've discovered. I've never seen this written down anywhere else. I don't know if anyone else has discovered it or not. I'll take credit for it if credit is due. A story will be more, well, an easy way to make a story more memorable is to simply include a color and a number. I don't know why it works. I have no idea why that works. Someone who knows more about, our mental hooks in the brain can explain that better than I can. But if you want to make a story memorable, include a color and a number. For example, I'm going to make something up here that I know is going to be scientifically inaccurate. So don't bother telling me it's scientifically inaccurate, okay? I spend time around pharmaceutical scientists because I've spoken to a convention of pharmaceutical scientists a number of times. So that's why this comes to mind. You could start a talk by saying, our lab came up with a new understanding of the role of calcium ion channels in getting drugs across the blood-brain barrier. Ho-hum. I mean, unless I'm dying to know how that works, you haven't really hooked me yet. But what if you were to start this way? I'll never forget the day. It was a Thursday. I was sitting in my lab. I was worn out. We'd been working hard all week, and there were 3 whiteboards spread across the room covered with formulas and equations in 3 different colors of dry erase marker. And all of a sudden, my eye went to the equation in the middle of the second whiteboard in green ink. And I realized that's the key to understanding the role of calcium ion channels in the blood-brain barrier. Now, your audience may not remember all the particulars of your work. They can go back and read your paper if they want the particulars. But I'll bet you, if you gave that talk at a scientific convention where there are dozens of other scientific talks, instead of it being quickly forgotten, somebody's going to walk away thinking, oh yeah, the green equation. It may sound like a silly example, but what it's doing is it's taking the audience inside your process, and that's where I think you can make a real connection. So I would say that where possible, if you can weave your story through the entire presentation, or at least use it at the beginning and come back to it at the end, that makes a terrific literary tool. Another question that has come in, I really appreciate all the questions that are coming in here. Should you tell a story about yourself or about the object of your need? For example, if the object is an endangered species for which you are working with others to recover, should the story be about the species and its needs, or about me, the researcher, trying to work with others to recover the species? Personal stories, I think, often, not always, often draw us in the most, particularly where the audience can identify with you. So, for example, the audience may not identify with you, the scientist, who's collected data for years on populations of this particular species in this particular environment. But if you tell me about the last time that you walked up into the mountains of Colorado, which is where I live, to check on the population of this tiny fish that's being affected by loss of wetlands, I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you. On the other hand, can you tell a story from the perspective, from the point of view of the endangered species? I wouldn't put it past you. I think you might be able to do that. What I would never do, absolutely rule this out, is tell a personal story where you are taking someone else's story and presenting it as your own. That's a no-no. And you can't do that with authenticity. It just won't work. Now, the next question that comes up is, do you feel the TED process tightly embraces these principles? I gave a TED talk. I spoke at the inaugural TEDx Billings event in Billings, Montana, because that's where I was living at the time. And I'm not going to direct you to that TED talk on the website because I've improved a lot since then, and I would do it quite differently now than the way I did it then. I think that as I understand the TED process, the best TED Talks are the ones that are very specific to one particular point. It's not the classic speech model of a point with 3 major points supporting it, et cetera. It's one thing, a singularity. And I think that storytelling lends itself, when done right, to developing a singular idea. If someone else wants to chime in on the subject of the TED process, maybe we've got people on the call who know more about it than I do. I see a question here that I think is similar to one I already answered. Does your story need to be about you versus the story of the research topic? For example, the virus seeking to take over a host despite an antibiotic. If you can tell that story from the standpoint of the virus, I think that might be very instructive. Because after all, a virus that kills its host is not going to survive very long, right? It could be done. It could be done. But remember that the story, to be effective, has to start with a strong desire that is thwarted initially by an obstacle. A wants B despite C. So think about what the strong desire is. And think about whether it's realistic for an entity other than you to have a strong desire that you could know. A desire to survive certainly could fall into that category. I think that the best stories I've heard tend to be personal stories because they can be told with the greatest authenticity, but that's not necessarily exclusive. Is there any trade-off with professionalism when bringing emotion and storytelling into a presentation? For example, giving a job talk versus a talk to the general public. There's actually two questions here. One is the idea of professionalism when storytelling is involved. I'm going to end in a moment with a story and leave you to answer that one for yourself, because I don't think there needs to be any conflict between professionalism and including a story in your talk. The other question that's implied here is, do you do the same thing when giving a job talk, that is a talk within an audience that presumably already is familiar with you and your work, versus a talk to the general public? Yes, there is a difference there, because if you're talking to people who already know you and are familiar with your work, you need not place as much importance on building trust. Presumably they already trust you, they already know you, they know your work. So in that case, you may be able to go into a higher level a little bit more quickly. But keep in mind, no matter how valuable your information is, the audience's need is to receive information from a trusted source. The audience's need is to receive information from a trusted source. And remember, your information goes nowhere if you don't meet the needs of your audience. Another question that's come up is, you could do these three things, the three tools I talked about, right? And still walk away from a talk feeling the same as before you knew how to do them. How can you find out? Well, one way is through a carefully crafted survey that you give your audience members after your talk. You may, depending on the circumstances, even be able to give them a before and after, as I have done today, where you were asked to respond to 3 statements before my talk and then after you'd received the bulk of it. It's not easy to do. It's harder to get hard data about how effective you are in a talk. But it's done in the social sciences. A course evaluation, for example, is a model you can follow. So there are some ways that you, excuse me, can assess your effect on the audience. Okay, interesting question here. Wow, I've got so many more questions coming in than I expected. I will take as many as I have time for. And then if I don't answer your question, please do email it to me and I'll do the best I can to get back to you quickly. You could do these 3 things. Oh, I did that one already. Although I resonate with the point about clarity, at the same time in science talks, it could be preliminary results open to discussion. How would you balance these 2 aspects? Certainly in science, you never want to couch your findings in terms that are more absolute than they truly are. I think what you do is you say, here is where we've moved the needle so far in our knowledge of this topic. Here's where we've moved the needle so far, and here's where it can go from there. If you were to go to my book, The Speaker's Quick Guide to Telling Better Stories, the last chapter in it has a couple of advanced techniques, and one of those really applies in this situation where I have to talk about a 5-step model instead of the 3-step model. The 5-step model I briefly mentioned earlier: character, conflict, cure, change, carry out, message. What do you do when the problem has not yet been resolved? There is no cure. You still have the character, the conflict, that is the striving for something. What you do and what you can do in that case is to use what's called the hypothetical cure. That's where you say, this is how far we've gotten so far, but what if someone came up with an experiment or a study design that would allow us to fill in these blanks? Then we might be able to tell X about the world, about our topic. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that the model is the be-all and end-all. We all know about models, right? All models are fictitious. Some are just more useful than others. So yeah, whoever asked that question, if you'd like to know a little bit more about that, email me and I might just be able to go ahead and send you some more information from the book. Can you talk a bit about the difference between clarity and certainty? Oh, yes, certainly can do that. Scientists don't want to make bold statements. Well, it was a scientist who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Now, again, that is engaging in a bit of hyperbole because we start with the word nothing. Clarity versus certainty. That's an important distinction to keep in mind. Just because you're clear on what your topic is and clear on the key relationships between the elements in your field of study, between the observations and the hypotheses, you can make that very clear to us while there's still uncertainty about what the final result is going to look like. Just be clear on what you know versus what you don't know. How do you do your concluding remarks when a host usually moderates the Q&A? You must let your moderator know. You must let your moderator know that after the Q&A, that you're going to need a couple of minutes for closing remarks. How do you preempt the "I'm just required to be here" response you get from students? I have encountered that before because I give seminars sometimes where people are sent by their bosses. And I just say, you tell me what is the most useful thing you could get out of the day today. I'll tell them that at the beginning of the day. And then I'll say, and I want you to check in with me at the end of the day and see if you've gotten that. So even with someone who may seem disconnected from you at first, if you will make the effort to connect with them and meet some need that they have, and that need may simply be a need to know their day isn't wasted, then I think you can do that. Are your models presented in your book or only in a workshop setting? They are both. They are in both. I have models, 3-story models in the book, The Speaker's Quick Guide to Telling Better Stories, and I also do workshops on these things. I'm going to have to call, a quick question here that I can give a quick answer to. The author of the 5 C's was someone named Craig Valentine. I encourage you to look him up. He's an excellent, excellent speaker. And I'm going to answer one other question here before I shift the direction, because I want to honor our intention to be done here at a certain time. Do you have thoughts on how virtual presentation differs from in-person? First of all, I think you need to be able to do an in-person presentation well, and that means understanding these principles of engaging your audience in order to do that in a virtual setting. Then in a virtual setting, sometimes you have to just do 10% more. Obviously, that's very unscientific. More effort, more intentionality in your engagement with people. One of the things I typically do in an in-person setting is I begin and end with a story. In a virtual setting, because people have so many more temptations to draw their attention away from the presenter, I tend to focus more on bringing us always back to the problem statement. The information goes nowhere if you don't meet the needs of your audience. Because as long as I've been trained in this, as I've discovered from hearing some other speakers, as long as you, my audience in this virtual setting, believe that I understand your problem and therefore can understand and recommend a solution to it, you're more likely to stay with me. So there is a little difference there. Story is, I think, perhaps more important in a personal setting, whereas coming back to the statement of the problem is proportionately a little more important in the virtual setting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop taking questions there. And again, if I had no way of knowing how many questions might come in, so it's entirely possible that I could have allowed more time for that. I do encourage you to go ahead and contact me. I'm going to ask you one more time for a live polling response, and that is, I want you to tell me simply what is, in a word or two, the best thing you got out of this webinar. And we're just going to have a little word cloud come in here. So type in your response. And while you do that, I'm going to remind you of some of the main points, which are: your information goes nowhere if you don't meet the needs of your audience. Never end on a Q&A. Make sure that you are focusing on the needs of your audience through understanding what they need and how you're serving them with your specific purpose. Use a tool like the Dobzhansky template to be crystal clear on your core message. Connect with your audience emotionally, even when, and I would go so far as to say, especially when your information is very technical, because your audience needs that in order to see that you're upholding your side of the grand bargain. Clarity, story, storytelling, engagement, audience. These are some of the words that are showing up big in our word cloud right here. I love seeing these come in. Emotion, clarity, story, engagement, audience. And I am going to give you that website link right now. Okay, so let me go back to my slides. If I have a chance, I'll come back to the word cloud and see how that evolves in a moment. Let me change my share back to this. Back to the slideshow. All right, here we go. Always remember to put connection before content. Yep. There we go. And empathy before evidence. That's the short version, and you've heard the long version already. Now, here is your special offer. I put this up along with a thanks to our sponsors, the Alan Alda Center, the Kavli Foundation, and the American Chemistry Society. But I want you to take particular note of that URL in the center of the screen, davidot.com/AKLC. What does that mean? Alda Kavli Learning Center, our sponsor or our host organization today. davidot.com/AKLC. Here's what you can expect when you go to that site. You will be asked for your email address. That's so I can send you further resources as they become available, not so I can spam you. And of course, you can always opt out of anything you're getting from me. But when you do enter the required information, it will take you through to another website that has a number of free resources available on it. Among those are a chapter from my most recent book, The Speaker's Quick Guide to Technical Presentations, the chapter on Q&A, in case you want to know more about why I handled Q&A the way I did. Also, the 5-minute first draft tool, as well as a short video, well, a 5-minute video, explaining it. So please do visit me at that site. There are other ways you can engage with me. You will see when you get there. And I see that we've gone a minute or so over. If I did not get to all of your questions, do feel free to email me, david@davidot.com, and I will do my best to get back to you promptly. That's our webinar for the afternoon. I'm going to turn it back over to Jamie.
Hi, David. Thank you so much. I loved hearing about your technique around putting connection before content and also about empathy before evidence. I thought that was awesome. That was such an informative and inspiring session. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
So we invite you all to visit aldacenter.org for further information about various science communication training workshops that we offer. And to finish up, we have a quick 2-question poll for all of you where we'd love your feedback. Finally, we want to thank the Kavli Foundation and the American Chemical Society for their generous support that makes it possible for the Alda Center to offer webinars such as these. Stay tuned for the poll. It should pop up right on your screen. Thank you again, everyone.